Thanks to everyone here who is joining us, both in this Zoom webinar, as well as folks who are joining us on our YouTube channel today. This event today is part of the ongoing New York City Russia Public Policy Series, which is jointly hosted by the Harriman Institute at Columbia University and the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, with support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Today's event is jointly sponsored by the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU and the Salzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm a professor of politics at NYU, the director of the Jordan Center, and co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. We are all shocked and horrified by what has transpired over the past week following Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. We thank our incredible set of panelists here for taking the time to speak with all of you today. The way the seminar will unfold is I will quickly introduce each of them now, and then more information will be available about them in the chat. I will then ask the panelists a series of questions instead of having prepared statements before opening up to questions from the audience. Due to the webinar format, there's no opportunity to ask questions directly, so you should leave your questions in the Q&A, which you can all find at the base of the Zoom meeting. There's a tab that says Q&A. You can leave questions in there at any time. But the first part of this will be me asking questions to the panelists, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. Due to the tremendous interest in the topic, I want to apologize ahead of time to people in the audience. I doubt we will have time to get to everybody's questions, so just apologizing that ahead of time right now. Brian, are you set to go?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to introduce our panelists here for you today, and then I will proceed to starting with the discussion. Brian Milakovsky has been working in Ukraine and Russia since 2009 in environmental, humanitarian, and economic development projects. For the past 5 years, he has lived in government-controlled areas of Luhansk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. He has written on socioeconomic aspects of the Donbas conflict for the Kennan Institute, Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, and other publications. Oxana Shevel is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University, current president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Shevel's current research projects examine the sources of citizenship policies in post-communist states, church-state relations in Ukraine, the origins of the separatist conflict in Donbass, and memory politics in post-Soviet Ukraine. She is the author of Migration, Refugee Policy, and State Building in Post-Communist Europe. Timothy Frye is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University. He's the author of Brokers and Bureaucrats, Building Markets in Russia, which won the 2001 Hewitt Prize from the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, and Building States and Markets After Communism, The Perils of Polarized Democracy, which won a Best Book Prize from the APSA Comparative Democratization section in 2010. His most recent book is Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. And finally, Kimberly Marten is a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's a faculty member of Columbia's Harriman Institute for Russia, Eurasian, and East European Studies and the Salzman Institute for War and Peace Studies. She's written 4 books, including Warlords, Strong-Arm Brokers in Weak States, and Engaging the Enemy, Organization Theory and Soviet Military Innovation, which received the Marshall Shulman Prize. The Council on Foreign Relations published her special report, Reducing Tensions Between Russia and NATO in 2017. I hope you will all join me in thanking everyone who's participating here for taking the time to do this today. We know that the demands on everybody's time here is just immense at this moment in time. We also know that this is a very difficult topic to discuss. All of us have friends, some have family who are affected by this conflict in many ways, and our heart go out to everybody. But as scholars, we're going to try to contribute here by offering expertise in the public domain. So I want to start. I will note as well, it is possible we will be joined at some point during the webinar by Volodymyr Kulyk, who is a head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies, the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Volodya is actually in Kyiv right now. We have no idea if he is going to be able to join us. If he does join us, I will introduce him more fully at that point in time. I'm going to start with Brian. And Brian, what can you tell us about the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine right now? We hear a lot in the news about what's going on in the south, what's going on in Kyiv, a bit in the west. What's happening in the east specifically in Ukraine that you can let us know about now?
Yeah, I'll try to briefly without getting into the sort of military weeds. I know that's not what our audience here is looking for, but I think it's important to understand that this is really an extension, an extremely violent escalation extension of an 8-year conflict, of course, in the Donbass region. And so a lot of the pieces were already in place for the East to come under enormous pressure. Right now, the city of Mariupol, 500,000 people, is virtually surrounded, virtually cut off, and one of the most violent hotspots right now in the country. The community that I lived in for the last 5 years with my family now, Severodonetsk is also under siege, under terrifying shelling. And what we see is a pressure coming from multiple sides, potentially in order to carry out Putin's threat of expansion of the so-called People's Republics to the entirety of those two provinces, which is more or less an arbitrary decision that, of course, that they should overlap with what are Ukrainian provinces, although they don't recognize them as such. It's an extraordinary process because many parts of the East are absolutely not demonstrating, I think, what the Russian government was expecting, which was apathy or celebration, partially because of the simply horrifying violence that Russia has released. But I think we're reminded again and again how poorly they understand Ukrainian society, in that, for instance, many of the more rural communities on the outskirts, places that you might have seen in the news like Starobilsk, Svatova, have seen a civil society peaceful uprising, more or less, when the Russian tanks show up, which seem to come in and out. They're sort of roaming the territory, trying to hold a large area by simply demonstrating some presence. And when they roll into communities like Starobilsk and Svatova, they're cursed and screamed at by locals. Also, and we've seen this in other communities like the Sea of Azov region, places like Milakovsky and Berdyansk, Kharkiv region, places like Kupiansk. This is what they imagined would be their core territory to expand their separatist project, the Russian government. And they're discovering that the basis is not there, and so can only be applied through, it can only be created through massive violence. It's tragic. At the same time, it's an extraordinary moment to understand what the role of Eastern Ukraine and Ukrainian society in general. So much of the violence is being applied in that region. The Russians probably really seem to believe they could cakewalk into, and I think they're learning that Eastern Ukraine is a profoundly different place. Even those parts of it that are also the Donbass, just like the territories they've been controlling for 8 years, is a far different place. It has changed in 8 years. It was never the place they thought it was to begin with. And so again, only I think a small number of communities have they been able to assert a sort of soft takeover, because they did have a basis of support there. It appears in places like Stanitsa Luhanska, near the former capital of Luhansk, they were able to more or less just walk in. A few other places along the Russian border, much less of a welcome mat virtually everywhere else. And so what's really tragic and horrifying that they're replacing, I would say that they're replacing the welcome they thought they'd get with coercion, violence on a scale that's just terrifying. So that's what I'd say in a nutshell is what's going on in the East right now. Intense pressure, an extraordinary expression of the real place of that region in Ukrainian society. An enormous, not a rebirth, it's been there all this time, a re-expression of the civil society that emerged in 2014 in the East, in both humanitarian response, civil society development, and in resistance. It was there on the ground and still is today, and is kicking back into high gear. And that's extraordinarily important for Ukraine and the fate of that society. Here, if they have to be displaced within Ukraine or even abroad, I think it's very important for the Ukraine that emerges from this terrible war.
Thank you very much, Brian. Oksana, I want to turn to you next. According to many sources out of Russia, Putin expected Kyiv to fall in 2 days and the war to largely be over by now. What can you tell us about the Ukrainian resistance and all the reasons why you think that sort of story, which the Russians were telling to themselves, has not taken place? And what in particular can you tell us about this from the Ukrainian side and the resistance moving forward?
Right, thank you. Well, I'll begin by seconding what Brian just said. I think Putin's deep misunderstanding of Ukraine is on full display, and it's really tragic. But I mean, I think he does believe his own narrative, or at least did, that, Ukrainians are ultimately Russian and, they're ruled by some sort of clique of Nazis / drug users. And then once, the Russian troops come in, they would either be welcomed as liberators or people will basically don't care because, the government is corrupt. And that's not what we see, right? So there is certainly massive underestimation of Ukrainian society. I would also say, I think the Ukrainian army, I'm no military expert, but I mean, given it's not just the Russians, it seems like the West did not expect the army to be doing as well as it's doing. So I don't know anything about the military part of it, but I think if we're looking at the kind of going forward, what are the likely outcomes? I think it would really come down to whether or not Ukrainian army can continue creating it incredibly difficult for them to advance any further, right? Because we have now, they've taken essentially one oblast in Ukraine. There are this regional, regional center. In Ukraine, there are some 24 or so oblasts, right? They are in the region of the country that's supposed to be most Russia friendly. So just to think about what it would take, and Putin doesn't, I don't think he has plan B. I think he really, that's what he wants. He wants to go to Kyiv. He wants to decapitate the government. He wants to denazify the country, as he says. And I should also make it clear that denazification, as he sees it, it's not just removal of the Jewish president and Russian-speaking cabinet, and or not some fringe far-right groups that exist in Ukraine. It literally would extend to the civil society, to the journalists, to academics, basically anybody who does not buy Putin's view of history or his, notion that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Everybody would be a target. So we are really talking about, it would not be an exaggeration to say that if he levels Ukraine and whichever part of it he controls, we are going to have like concentration camps, mass repression against, the civilian population under the guise of fighting Nazism. So I think that's important, also to keep in mind. So, I think the Ukrainian society is completely mobilized. I have close family and friends in Ukraine. And, as my aunt, who is like 70 some years old, my grandfather fought against the Nazis and actually West Ukrainian nationalists in the Second World War. She's talking about, as she put it, the tsunami of hatred against these orcs. Like this is the sentiment, that spread far and wide. So just sort of thinking about what it would take to control the country of this size with this, hostile population. I think we really have a race against time here. I think basically the longer the Ukrainian defenses can hold, and I understand, as an analyst about the no-fly zone, how the West doesn't get involved, potential, nuclear retaliation by Putin and so forth. But I would add two things here. First of all, we don't actually know what would cause Putin to escalate further, to use some sort of nuclear tactical weapon. So it's really uncharted territory. I think he's really unhinged, to put it mildly. And secondly, short of the no-fly zone, I mean, Ukraine could receive, air defense systems, could receive airplanes. I think all of that would matter greatly because we have several moving pieces here. On the one hand, sort of what goes on the battlefields in Ukraine and the resistance that Russians are getting. And then the processes that would, I'm sure, I mean, I'm not going to speak about it now, but hopefully, we can talk about it in the Q&A. How would Russia be affected by this? I don't think Russia would remain unchanged, right? We can talk about sort of the changes potential in the society, the impact of sanctions. These are not, the quote unquote dark-skinned Chechens they're bombing, right? Or some faraway Syrians. I mean, these are relatives, family members of, a lot of the Russian population, right? It's like, what would happen in Russia? How long would it take before things begin to look quite different there? So I think that's another moving piece. So this sort of interaction of these things. So that's what I would say. I don't think there is plan B. I mean, all the talk about some sort of off-ramp for Putin, he is there to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign state, like no more and no less, right? I mean, rather there may be more we can talk about, but certainly no less. So any kind of like expansion of the breakaway territories, right? Or control creation of the so-called Novorossiya, which is supposed to incorporate, southeastern part of Ukraine. I think we are past that, right? Like as long as the government in Kiev holds, as long as, there is Ukrainian state, he's not going to be satisfied. So I think, that's, I think, unfortunately, the situation that we're facing, at least the way that I see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Oksana. Picking up on what Oksana just said about how this is going to change Russia, Tim, I want to turn to you next. As political scientists, right, we know autocrats need to have support, right? We tend to think of autocrats as being different, different from democratic leaders who need to be elected by the population, but autocrats need support too, whether it's, from mass support, whether it's from the elites around them who keep them in power, from the autocrat's perspective, ideally from both. I'm wondering if you could speak now a bit towards Putin's level of support at this point in this moment in Russia, but also how you expect this to evolve going forward, both in light of what Oksana talked about momentarily ago, about all these connections between Russian and Ukrainian society and people's relatives and people's access to relatives and people's communication with relatives, but also in light of the sanctions and the likely changes the sanctions are likely to have impacts on Russian society. And I would, if I may, push you a little bit to address a question that you hear a lot of people talking about as to whether or not this could actually begin to threaten Putin's hold on power in Russia. What do you think the sort of likelihood of this is the case? And if not, if the sanctions and these issues are not going to actually threaten Putin's hold on power, what do you think the likely impact of the sanctions and all the connections to Ukrainians will be on Russian society and the course of the conflict? So, Tim?
Thanks for the question, and thanks to the panelists. I really appreciate your comments. The decision to invade Ukraine was likely taken by Putin himself. There's good evidence that in 2014, the decision to invade Crimea was taken by Putin personally. It was likely discussed by only a subset of the Security Council. Journalists who have much better contacts within the Russian state have reported as such, and I think it makes sense. Putin's view that Ukrainians and Russians are one people and that Ukraine should not be a sovereign state is a view that is not widely held in the Russian foreign policy establishment. It's certainly not held in the broader public. The Levada Center, a very reputable polling agency in Russia, has for decades asked a question about how most Russians would like to see relations with Ukraine. And they give them three options, two of which recognize Ukrainian state sovereignty. And 80% of Russians would like some form of good relations with Ukraine and recognize state sovereignty. And only 20% have reported that they would like to see a unification with Ukraine. This is just not a burning issue for most Russians. They've moved on from the Soviet experience. They don't get up in the morning and think, my life would be materially better if Russia occupied half of Ukraine. So the foreign policy establishment, I don't think believed that Putin would launch an invasion on this scale. I think they were skeptical that Putin would even introduce Russian troops across the border. We heard for weeks that this was all just a bluff, that Putin was just using military leverage in order to get gains on the ground, perhaps to get the Zelensky government to cave and sign the Minsk II agreement. And I think there's a great reassessment that's going on among the Russian elites who are suffering tremendously from economic sanctions. And among the Russian elite, they can see how isolated and how bleak the future looks for Russia. I think most Russians have no idea of the incredible isolation that they're likely to face globally, and how bleak a future is in the fortress Russia, which seems to be, the Putin and the war cabinet's view of how Russia should develop. There's a lot of steps between economic sanctions and tremendous pain and actually overthrowing the government. Economic elites in Russia have not been as powerful in the last 2 or 3 years. They've largely been usurped by a small group of Putin's war cabinet centered around the security services who seem to be calling the shots both domestically and abroad. The possibility of elite defection among the economic elite and the foreign policy elites who don't agree with this policy is very difficult because, yes, they're suffering with by sticking with the regime, but they may likely fear that they would be punished even more should they defect from the regime and Putin stay in power. So it's difficult for them to coordinate their activities to try to overthrow Putin, or even to try to put pressure on Putin and the war cabinet to change course. The Russian public right now has lost access to even that small pocket of independent voices that had continued to operate in Russia up until this week. The information environment is dominated by the state. If you look, I would encourage you to go to pravda.ru if you speak Russian, to see just a complete alternate reality in which Russian people are being told that there's great international support for the Kremlin's efforts, and that the Ukrainians are glad to be liberated. Just a complete alternate reality. That said, this isn't the first time that the Russians have been fed propaganda by their government, and they have a variety of means to get information about what is actually going on the ground in Russia. Social media. Russia's a very well-educated country, and there's a lot of family ties with people on the ground in Ukraine. And I think what we're seeing in Russia is really a fracturing of society between those who kind of favor the fortress Russia view of a Russia insulated from the outside world, with a very aggressive foreign policy that tries to make itself as autarkic as possible. Those groups within Russian society who have benefited from the stability of the last 20 years, who've built a life based on that stability, and want relations with the outside world, and can recognize the bleak future for Russia. So it's really a battle within Russia between those who would like to see Russia walled off from the rest of the world, and a Russia that would like to bring their country into the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Tim. There's a lot there to follow up on, but I want to turn first to Kim. And Kim, could you talk to us about the broader international implication of Russia's invasion? Around what does this say about US and NATO security concerns? What does this say about China and how China is responding? And I think at that point, then we'll have most of the different pieces of this on the ground, and we can dig into different parts of it in more detail. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And let me join Tim in thanking our fellow panelists. Just incredible perspectives that we've got here. So let me start by talking about the question that Oxana raised. Why isn't there a no-fly zone? NATO's fundamental purpose is self-defense. And we could argue about cases in the past where NATO has used offensive airstrikes, for example, in Bosnia and Kosovo and Libya. But when those have been done, it's always been done in the sense of how is this going to protect NATO's security? And the concerns in those cases were always about refugee flows that could overwhelm NATO and create stability problems in NATO countries, or in the case of Bosnia and Kosovo, that ethnic conflict would expand and end up engulfing NATO borders. And so even if we can argue about how truthful that self-perception of NATO has been, it means that NATO is never going to take any action that is seen as being dangerous to NATO's security. So if NATO were to get directly involved in a war like this, where Russia is on the other side, that would be the one thing that is most likely to provoke either Putin believing that it's necessary to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, or to carrying out a devastating cyber strike, which we haven't seen yet, and certainly to the expansion of war onto other European territories, which would mean the start of another world war in Europe. Already we've seen that the initial promise that some NATO countries, not through NATO auspices, actually through European Union auspices, were going to send combat aircraft to Ukraine seems to have fallen apart. And the concern there was that the only way to get those aircraft to Ukraine would be to fly into Ukraine, and that Russia could see those airplanes coming in and therefore might shoot them down over NATO's territories, and that in and of itself bore the risk of expanding the conflict to NATO territories. And so I think the only circumstance in which NATO would get directly involved in Ukraine, beyond the question of sending weapons and sending advisory assistance, which is already happening, is if Russia intentionally were to target a NATO member country. So what NATO needs to concentrate on, what it is concentrating on, is deterring Putin from invading NATO territory, which would include Poland or the Baltics. And the particular concern at the moment is what's called the Suwalki Gap. It's this very small 65-mile border between Poland and Lithuania. You have Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave, on one side, which is very heavily militarized, and Belarus on the other side. And what we've seen in the last few weeks is that the Belarusian military forces seem to be becoming very integrated with Russian military forces. They've always conducted joint exercises for many years, but it now seems that they are becoming one fighting force, and that Belarusian military forces are actually coming under Russian command. And so what that means is that on either side of this gap of the border between Poland and Lithuania, you have very heavily militarized what is essentially Russian forces. And that would very much complicate NATO's ability to resupply or to defend the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And of course, Latvia and Estonia both have significant Russian ethnic minority populations. And so that might be a place where Putin would be potentially, tempted to take some kind of an action. Now, it doesn't mean that NATO couldn't defend those areas, but what it means is that the defense of those areas would be very complicated, would probably involve casualties. And then the question becomes at a political level, can you imagine that in the United States in particular, that the American public would be willing to see American troops coming under direct threat of death from Russians in order to defend Estonia and Latvia, two countries that a lot of Americans probably don't know anything about and couldn't identify on a map. And so what NATO has been doing, what the United States has been doing, is trying to emphasize that those are parts of NATO, that they will be defended in order to deter Putin from expanding the war. But I think that the really dangerous part is going to come is if Russia continues to have success in taking Ukrainian cities, continues to move towards the West. What's going to happen if Russia starts actually approaching NATO border areas? And the problem there is that accidental conflicts could arise between convoys that were trying to resupply or convoys that were trying to take out Ukrainian refugees into the West. And that's something that we have to watch, and that really is a danger spot going forward. Briefly on China, China's in a tough spot. On the one hand, it has, come out in favor of this idea that there is a conflict between authoritarian and democratic states. And so it has been happy over recent years to see conflict between Russia and the West. But on the other hand, we have to keep in mind that China's trade and investment is an order of magnitude larger with both Europe and North America than it is with Russia. Russia needs China a heck of a lot more than China needs Russia. And so rather than concentrating on any verbal statements that China makes, we should be concentrating on the actions that China takes. And what we saw in 2014, 2015 is that even Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese state-owned banks didn't want to get on the wrong side of American sanctions because of the power of American banks in Europe, and because of the power of SWIFT sanctions and the possibility of secondary sanctions against China. And so my guess is that China is going to do everything it can to not become a part of this. Just one last comment. Ukraine is a major grain exporter to much of the world, including to many countries in Africa. There are questions about what's going to happen right now with Ukrainian harvest of its current wheat and corn crops, what's going to happen over the summer with harvest of those crops. Russia has already cut off a lot of Ukrainian ports, and it looks like Russia has the intention of cutting off even more. One of the effects of this may be food crises that are happening in the rest of the world. And on that sober note, I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Kim. Brian, I want to come back to you now and kind of get into the weeds just a little bit more of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. A great deal has been made over the past 8 years, especially the past 4 or 5 years, going back to 2016, about Russia's capacity for hybrid warfare. Kim mentioned the possibility of sort of devastating cyber attacks in the West, but I want to sort of concentrate on the sort of hybrid warfare as defined as information warfare. Do you see signs from people who you're talking to in Ukraine and in Eastern Ukraine, signs of this sort of vaunted hybrid warfare of taking control of the information environment? Tim was talking a bit about the information environment inside of Russia, but are there signs of this in Ukraine now? Do you think most people in Ukraine are able to get accurate information at this point about what's going on elsewhere? Are you aware of disinformation campaigns that seem to be part and parcel with the Russian invasion that are gaining any traction at all? So I'll throw that, and you can take that question in any direction you want. But I want to get a sense of whether, everything we've talked about here has been about the sort of physical warfare. Is the hybrid warfare that we heard about so much actually taking place? There seems to be a bit of a narrative that it is not proven to be as big a deal as people thought it was.
I think one place that we definitely should be looking to understand what that's going to look like is Kherson. The first major city to be taken under Russian control, where they aren't sort of just moving in and out trying to control it as a sort of territorial hub, which they came in and out of a number of cities, but have really settled down, taken control of the TV tower, and allegedly already begun broadcasting their own version of the universe, which somehow has to convince people that they didn't just experience the horrifying violence that they did, or that if so, it was from the side of Ukraine. I have seen on a much smaller scale some information coming out, as I said, in the East. There are a limited number of communities, mostly along the Russian border or directly along the border of the so-called People's Republics, that Russia has also sort of already taken control over. It's not just sort of logistically trying to hold them. One of them, as I mentioned, was Stanitsa Luhanska, which is a very, very particular community, suffered terribly over the last 8 years from the back and forth artillery war, suffered particularly badly in 2014, is actually one of the few territories, I think, in Eastern Ukraine where Putin's whole hypothesis that, these are Russian territories that never should have been included in Ukraine, at least is, debatable, that easily the territory of Stanitsa Lugansk could have been included in the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic instead of the Ukrainian. It's dominated by a sort of subculture of Russians, the Don Cossacks, which is a very particular military subculture. So it's a very complex place. And I've seen some perspectives coming out of that town already, now that it's been occupied, in which I heard people saying, well, it seems now we're going to have to create a new Ukraine with new relationships, which to me really seems like a Russian talking point kind of phrase, very sort of maudlin, very seemingly harmless, but it was spoken from the mouth of a resident of Stanitsa Luhanska in a group chat that I'm a part of, to a bunch of other Ukrainians in the East, sort of saying to them, hey, calm down, guys. It's really not so bad here under occupation. No one was executed yet. Things are fine. We're just going to, have to have a new Ukraine. And I think we really need to watch that space. We need to watch the space of these actively occupied communities and the way that Russia's going to be trying to impose their reality. I think beyond those communities, and even within them, I know there are people within those communities that will resist physically, or at least intellectually, I hope their safety is insurable. There have been extremely worrying, reports that the FSB is creating execution lists. I think we need to see what happens. There has been a lot of loose intelligence floating around, but that's extremely worrying and frankly, after all this violence, believable. We need to watch what goes on in those communities. Outside of them, as I said, a number of communities I think the Russians believe would sort of just be very porous for them, would open up, have absolutely not accepted the sort of push of information warfare that came ahead of the troops and the tanks. And we're extremely unresponsive. And those include, small working class rural communities that, in my experience, might actually demonstrate high levels, for instance, of Soviet nostalgia, are bilingual, voted regularly for the opposition platform for life, but have a understanding of the country they belong to, and have enough pro-Ukrainian people, for instance, to stop a column of tanks simply by blocking the street and screaming profanities in Russian at Russian soldiers. So, again, I don't think that the information warfare that they sort of just saturated the region with, their messaging, their view of the world, worked nearly as they thought it would. But we need to watch very carefully what they're going to do, where they can physically control and threaten people and deeply impose their news and their media. And like I said, in places like Stanitsa, Luhansk, I'm seeing a certain maybe openness of some residents to that, and this concept of this new Ukraine, the conditions of which, the shape and form of which will be defined by the Russian occupation.
Oxana, I know you said in your opening remarks that you think at this point there is no kind of off-ramp in Putin's mind. But if I could push you just a little bit, because we have a question from Paige Fortna, who just to introduce just a tiny moment of lightness to this incredibly serious discussion. Paige was actually the TA for both Oxana and I in graduate school in our intro to statistics class in our first semester of graduate school many years ago. But Paige wants to know if there is an off-ramp and there is the possibility of some sort of negotiated settlement, if things go down that direction, what sort of concessions, either territorial or otherwise, are possible for Ukraine politically? So you said in your opening remarks, Oxana, that you thought Putin at this point, there was nothing on the table for him other than the complete destruction of Ukraine. For Ukrainians at this point, is there nothing on the table other than the complete withdrawal of troops? Or is there some, politically at this point, and we've seen the public opinion number, the incredible heroic work doing public opinion surveying right now in Ukraine, tremendous support of the Ukrainian people for the regime and for the effort. And Oxana, you talked about the support of civil society for this. Do you think that there is would there be any political space in Ukraine for something like what people thought at the beginning of this conflict might have been the sort of where this all thing was heading, was Luhansk and Donetsk declaring independence, and then the question of whether that, that territorial independence would be recognized, maybe the larger republics being recognized, or is that completely off the table at this point from the Ukrainian perspective?
Yeah, let me speak about that, because I think this is something probably for all of us sitting in our comfortable offices, right? It's kind of hard to imagine, if your choice is potentially to die or to agree to some sort of live under occupation, isn't that human instinct to choose to live, right? And I'm no psychologist and I can't say, how I would respond in this situation, but what we are seeing across Ukraine, people are ready to die. This is they are going to fight to the last. And there is no concession that Ukraine is willing to make, to basically not exist, because that's what we're talking about. I think what could have been in a way after Putin, let me elaborate a little bit. So when Putin recognized the independence of these so-called republics, right? It's not that people in Ukraine were happy about it, but the general thinking was look, they already control these territories, right? Like, we are not going to go, I mean, there was no plan in Ukraine to go fight militarily to take them back or to take over Crimea, right? That was sort of the new, like, that was the reality that was created in 2014. You know, there was definitely not sort of, you know, Ukrainian concession to agree to this, right? But at the same time, you know, people were not going to take up arms and go fight to liberate Donetsk or Luhansk or, you know, whichever other region there, right? Now I think we're in a different situation because concession, like what kind of concession would look like now? I mean, Putin is very clear that he does not want the state to exist, right? So like, I can't imagine, honestly, like what sort of concession would be that Putin would agree to, short of the destruction of the Ukrainian state, right? I mean, he's going to Kiev for a reason. They want to kill Zelensky government, right? And then have some sort of like declare somebody to be the president who would then say, okay, like, you know, this is now new Ukraine, you know, like Brian was saying. So in Ukraine, I think absolutely not. I don't think there is any support. You know, we have the recent poll came out just a few days ago. 88% of the country believes they can win. I mean, you can sit there and say like these people are like lunatics, right? Like if I, you know, if I didn't talk to people in there and it was some other country, I would also say like these people are delusional. But like nobody wants to live as a slave. It's sort of, it comes down to that, right? And when they see the destruction that the Russian forces are wreaking on the country. So I honestly don't see, you know, again, like if things stopped where they were, right? Like Putin could have, you know, going forward probably for many years, controlled Ukraine, I mean, controlled Crimea and controlled these breakaway republics, you know, that they recognized. Like that was, you know, facts on the ground, right? Like clearly that's not enough for him, right? He's talking about denazifying the country and, you know, eliminating it as a sovereign entity. So I don't think there would be, you know, again, unless Zelensky government is killed and there is somebody else who they would declare to be the president, who would have like zero legitimacy. And then that person would say, like, after, you know, East Ukraine and the capital city is leveled to the ground, you know, like that would be new reality, right? And then it still leaves, you know, the western and central part of the country. I mean, Kim, I mean, I take your point. I think you're right that, you know, I mean, again, like as an analyst, I understand this no-fly zone, you know, involvement and so forth. But talking about security for NATO, this is a country of 44 million people, right? Like the kind of refugee crisis, what sort of it can produce. We already have over 1 million people fled. They took one regional capital, and it's 1 million people, right? Imagine how many millions it would be, right? If this sort of brutal advance continues, right? So what we have seen, so to your question, I mean, I don't say, I think the answer is no. I don't think there is anything, you know, again, unless like, you know, if Putin took his troops back out and they just stayed in Crimea and then in the so-called republics, yeah, like Ukraine is not going to try to push them there. But as far as agreeing for them to occupy any further territory, right? I don't think Putin would agree to this because his goal is much broader. He doesn't just want to control Kherson or like extend the borders of these republics to the administrative borders of Donetsk and Luhansk region. Like, what's the point of that, right? Like, that doesn't really give him anything. The quote unquote Nazi run Ukraine would continue to exist, right? Just in a slightly smaller territory. Like, he wants to take out the country as a sovereign entity. Okay, maybe I'll just stop there. I'll talk about that.
Okay, but I do just want to like push you on one point of that, because what you got to what you were saying at the end of your statement there. So if, I mean, and I will posit, you know, everything you've said is correct about every indication we have of what Putin is willing to stand for. The question that was asked was about the space in Ukrainian politics for this kind of an off-ramp. Let's imagine, this is incredibly hypothetical, but let's imagine Putin is no longer running the show in Russia, right? He gets hit by a bus tomorrow and somebody else comes to somebody else takes over. And then the proposal is made to, as you said there, to expand to the territory of Luhansk and Donetsk, right? And that recognize the independence of these states, recognize the independence of Crimea, and the troops will be pulled out of the rest of the country. Do you think there is political space in Ukrainian politics at this point to accept something like that as a potential off-ramp, as unlikely as it seems right now?
I see what you said. Well, obviously, we are all speculating here, right? But what I would say to this, I think we should make a distinction between Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, right? Because as Brian was saying, even in Donetsk and Luhansk, in the government-controlled part of the country, there is no red carpet for the invaders, right? In the occupied Luhansk, again, keeping in mind that, yes, there was strong pro-Russian sentiment there in 2014, but there was also pro-Ukrainian sentiment, right? And more pro-Ukrainian people left. And now they're conscripting miners and taxi drivers and whoever to fight, the Ukrainians in this, right? So I think I guess the attitudes both within these regions. I mean, there is no like natural logic, like why that should be the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk, like that just, you know, it. So I think there could be some settlement. I can envisage some kind of settlement, right? When Ukraine agrees to some sort of something rather in Crimea other than getting Crimea back, right? Potentially maybe some sort of like, I don't know, I can't imagine, but I'm just saying I want to draw a distinction between Crimea and Donbass, right? Because I think in Donbass it's a different story than in Crimea, right? Some sort of like internationally managed, like with some, you know, referendum down the road or something along the lines of that. Like, again, we're totally speculating, but I'm just saying if we're talking about the realm of possibilities in Ukraine, I think, first of all, I would draw this distinction between Crimea and Donbass. And then, you know, maybe something to do with Crimea could indeed be, you know, on the table, right? If they got out of the rest of Ukraine. But I think, as I was just saying, like, that's not what Putin wants. So I can't imagine the kind of off-ramp when Putin would say, okay, like, I'm going to now pull all the way back, right? Give you some money to repair the damage, right? And, you know, let's talk about, right? So maybe if there is a different leader in the Kremlin, like, I think that potentially could be on the agenda, yes.
Okay, thanks, Oxana. Tim, we're getting a lot of questions in about Russian domestic politics, so I'm going to try to bundle a few of them together here right now. One question is about, which we've all heard a lot about, is the restrictive free speech law promising to imprison anyone for 15 years who uses words like war and invasion or calls for not sending more troops to Ukraine or all sorts of other, generally speaking out against the war. This is still in flux. But do you think, one part of this question is, do you think restrictive measures like this will turn his constituents away from him, or will it leave them too scared to push back? And then kind of somewhat related to that, also on this question of support for Putin is, you know, from one anonymous person in the Q&A, is there an alternative to Putin, right? In 1917, there was a communist party ready to take over, right? Like, is there, you know, we've talked a lot about the ramping up of repression in the last couple of years. Is there an opposition that if you know, is there an alternative there if someone were to do this, or are we looking only at a kind of elite level shuffling of the deck chairs? And then I guess one other question from Edmund Levin, who said, you know, who has said in light of what you've written in your book about the need for support of autocrats, you have Putin seems to have made little or no attempt to prepare people, and both the masses and the elites, for this conflict. So is this, and this may be exactly because of what we've been saying throughout this seminar already, that Putin was living in an alternative reality where he thought that this conflict was going to be over by this point in time. And so he didn't need to do this and he could just run the gamut quickly. But are there other examples from your research of autocrats who have done this in the past, who have launched sort of, you know, potentially long-standing conflicts without any attempt to prepare elites or to prepare masses around them? Or is this really kind of an outlier? Are we in sort of uncharted territory here? So there's a bunch of questions. I'm sort of bundling, giving you some time to talk more about Russian politics around Putin here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I had to jot down some notes there just to keep all the questions straight. So thanks a lot. Those are all excellent questions. I mean, in addition to the war that Putin has unleashed on Ukraine, he's also brought repression to Russia on scales that we just have not seen, since Soviet days. And in some ways, the unpredictability of the repression within Russia is much greater than in much of the Soviet period, when people could calculate what their consequences were for their opposition. So the Kremlin has a problem in that they initially pitched this operation as a special military operation, that it wasn't a war. I think in the expectation that would all be over in 2 or 3 days. So this has left them without an alternative narrative to prepare people for what looks like will be most likely a long, bloody confrontation that will bring great cost to Russia that can't be hidden by the Russian state. So for the moment, the clampdown on private media and the incredible bias in the state media has, kept a narrative going that has tried to downplay the events in Ukraine and the consequences for Russia. But those are becoming, I think, apparent to anybody who wants to see them. Just all the bans on foreign companies pulling out, the bans by international organizations. And I want to echo something that Oxana said before, that what happens on the ground in Ukraine matters a lot for Ukraine, but it also matters a lot for Russian politics. The longer that this goes on, the more difficult it is for the Kremlin to justify their actions and the loss of life that the Russian military is inflicting on Ukrainians, and the loss of life on Russian casualties. Public opinion in Russia tends to be very sensitive to casualties. The World War II narrative cuts two ways for Putin. On the one hand, it allows him to rally nationalist sentiment in the defense of Russia. At the same time, Russians know the cost of war. This is socialized into Russians from a very early age. And even if we look at public opinion, which right now I think is a very noisy measure, during war, but even during 2014, 2015, when I think the polls in Russia were very reliable, even when fighting was hot in eastern Ukraine in May of 2014, only 31% of Russians supported the introduction of Russian troops into the fighting in eastern Ukraine. And a year later, that figure was only 20%. So like Oksana, there's a big distinction between Crimea, which caused this huge upsurge in support for Putin, and the great reticence and skepticism of the Russian public about using troops in eastern Ukraine. We're going to get a lot of, I'm sure, within Russia, a lot of public opinion data that's coming out. This is probably better than anecdotes, but we need to be very careful about social desirability bias, people telling pollsters that they support the war when they may not. And also, even people answering the polls honestly are likely to have very volatile opinions. And this is a problem for outside researchers, but it's even a bigger problem for the Kremlin, because Russian society has become a lot less legible to the Kremlin. The more repression it uses, the harder it is to gauge public opinion in Russia. And why does public opinion matter in Russia? Russia's an autocracy. But the more that Putin has to rely on repression, this is a very costly strategy. Autocrats would much rather rely on economic growth, on policy successes, and not have to use repression, which could eventually spark a backlash. So earlier, Putin had other tools that he could use to legitimate his narrative, and now he's had to rely much more heavily on censorship and repression. Are there alternatives? The second question, are there alternatives to Putin? There always are. In every autocracy, there are ambitious politicians who think that they could do a pretty good job running Russia, who would like the perks. It's not usually wise to advertise that ambition for many reasons. But the notion that there's nobody waiting in the wings, I think history just suggests that no one is irreplaceable. And given the narrow group of circle around Putin who has made this decision, policy might be very different of a leader from outside of that circle. And so why was there so little preparation for the actions that Russia has taken in Ukraine? Well, I think Putin thought that this could all be done as a surprise, and he didn't want word to get out. So the more that the Kremlin prepared the public and the foreign policy elite for the possibility of a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, the less he would be able to use the element of surprise. So I think the strategy was, as long as we can have a lightning strike to Kyiv and take over the capital, then we'll be able to tell this triumphant tale of that we have rectified this great historical injustice of Ukraine being torn away from Russia, and that has just not been borne out. So the longer that the conflict goes on in Ukraine, and it's likely to go on for a long time, the more difficult it will be for Putin to maintain his popularity. There will be groups who support this within Russia, but I think on balance, the longer the war goes on, the worse this is for Putin's standing with the Russian public.
Thanks, Tim. Apologies, my computer crashed and I had to jump onto a different computer. I do want to follow up with one other question for you, Tim, which is, there have been rumors of Putin being considering declaring martial law within Russia. How would that affect the equation here?
Well, it really undercuts the narrative that this is just a special military operation, and that this is, not a, this is just a regular order of what great powers do. Declaring martial law would tell everyone in Russia that what the real stakes are involved, and the Kremlin has tried to hide those stakes so far. Operationally, given the the passage of this law on issuing misinformation as defined by the Kremlin on the Ukraine situation and the possibility of long jail sentences and the real costs that Russians who are opposing the war face, operationally, it might not make a huge difference. It might give them a reason to close the border and not allow Russians to leave. But this also might be counterproductive because, the groups that are most likely to engage in protest within Russia are also likely the groups that are trying to get out of Russia and who have left Russia over the last 5 or 6 years for a variety of reasons. So operationally, I'm not sure it would make a huge difference on the ground, given what the Kremlin has already done.
Thanks, Tim. Kim, we've gotten a lot of questions about NATO. And so I want to sort of focus on 2 of them. And then, unfortunately, I want to let the audience know my computer crashed. I switched to another computer, but I lost access to all the Q&A that was up there when I logged back into the webinar. So if you have asked a question in the Q&A that I haven't addressed yet, please feel free to put it back into the Q&A at this point in time. And my apologies about that. Kim, the 2 questions that I would like to put towards you that we've gotten from the audience regarding NATO are, first, is there anything that NATO is not doing now that NATO could be doing? We've talked about not having, we've talked about the issues of why NATO is unlikely to implement a no-fly zone, but are there escalatory steps that NATO could take that is not currently taken? And then the second question about NATO that we've gotten is, or sort of others, other implications of this outside of the immediate context, is discussions about Sweden and Finland moving to join NATO. We had a question about Moldova applying for EU membership. Do you think these are kind of likely steps that might end up being taken? That are not NATO getting more involved militarily, but NATO or the West taking more kind of integrative steps? And if you want to comment more generally on what you think the escalatory steps that are available to the West, if they are going to continue to stay out of being directly involved in the conflict in the way that you're talking about here.
Thanks, Josh. I want to just follow up on something Tim had said about avoiding casualties. One of the things that military experts who are watching the Russian invasion have noted is that Russia has carried mobile crematoriums into the field with it. And one of the purposes probably behind that is so that Russia can officially underestimate to its public the number of deaths that have actually occurred among Russian soldiers. The argument is that if you have bodies being shipped back, then you have public funerals funerals and people can watch those. Whereas if you have mobile crematoriums in the field, the families are notified, but the mourning is much more private. And so you have less of a way of seeing across the country what is actually happening among the number of people who are being killed. So I would support Tim's point on that. I think NATO is going to do everything it can to avoid escalation. One of the questions in the Q&A was about should NATO send ships through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea. In fact, the United States has been very careful to avoid those kinds of escalatory steps that are, primarily for optical reasons. So for example, the United States had a regular test of a missile system scheduled that it decided to cancel so that it did not get misinterpreted. And I think everybody has in mind the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we know back at that very early point that probably the most dangerous crisis that Russia and the United States have ever been in together before this, that there were all kinds of things that people had just forgotten about that could have gone wrong, that might have been misinterpreted by the other side. And so I think it's very unlikely that NATO or that any NATO country would send a warship into the Black Sea, even though technically under the Montreal Convention, it would be allowed to do so if it didn't have military purposes, violent purposes in mind, just because it would be perceived by Russia as being escalatory, and that's just not going to happen. On the Sweden and Finland question, that's a really interesting question. And what we've seen already is that Sweden and Finland, just in the last couple of weeks, have been completely welcomed into every NATO discussion about what's going on in Ukraine. And so part of the argument there might be that they don't actually have to join NATO to be part of the discussion. There is already such a high degree of cooperation on exercises, on joint planning and so forth, that they are effectively already cooperating with NATO, even if they don't join. One of the concerns is that for any new country to join NATO, it has to go through a long process of approval by each individual NATO member state. And if there were any prolonged process in this, even a process that lasted a matter of weeks to get it through parliaments, for example, in all of the countries that would have to agree to it in order to have it meet accession rules, that would give Russia a chance to really put into place threats or even direct military action against Sweden and Finland. And so somehow you'd have to have a complete changeover in NATO processes to allow this to happen at a moment's notice if Sweden and Finland were to declare that they wish to join. So I don't think that that's likely to happen as long as hostilities are active in Ukraine.
Thanks, Kim. Oksana, you want to jump in on that? Yep.
Yeah, let me just jump on that. So what else NATO can do quickly, right? I think what we've seen here, and I think that's important to keep in mind, that there has been kind of a pattern of NATO reacting, right, as opposed to being kind of proactive on this. So in other words, things that were completely off the table, right, even a few days ago, right, I mean, the fundamental change in German foreign policy that we talked about, right, that Germany was unwilling to deliver weapons, and now it's doing that and all of these things. I think this is what Ukrainians have been cautioning about, that they're saying, like, what has to happen, right? In other words, what kind of civilian catastrophe has to happen before, say, you do something more, right? So if, like, and what I was going to say, that I think between what's being done now militarily and, the no-fly zone, as Kim explained, that is not on the table, I think there is still quite a few possibilities, what NATO can do. Say with the planes, right? I mean, yes, like if NATO flew its own planes over Ukrainian border, maybe that's not, like NATO is not willing to do this, but Ukrainian flyers, pilots, right, are willing to go and fly these planes. How is that fundamentally different from sending the Stingers or other weaponry across the border, right? If, Putin continues to get military gains, right, like they can start bombing convoys, say, of military aid near the border of Western Ukraine, right? So all of these kind of escalations are still possible, right? So I guess what I'm saying, obviously, I don't know what NATO is strategizing, but I think, at least to my mind, it's still quite a moving story, right? And given how response before has unfolded in stages, I think we may still see something else being done on the part of NATO, even if it's not a no-fly zone.
Kim, yeah, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's really important that we keep in mind the distinction between NATO as an organization and individual NATO member states. So Oksana is very correctly talking about this change in German foreign policy. That's not a NATO action, that's a German action. So I don't expect that NATO as an organization is going to take some kind of operational decision. The weapons that we have seen coming into Ukraine are not being sent by NATO. They're being sent in by individual NATO countries. And I just want to make sure that we're very distinct on that point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think ultimately for Ukrainians, it doesn't matter if they're sent by NATO, if they're sent individually by Bulgaria or whatever, right? Like I think if these planes do come, that could make a difference, right? And that's maybe.
But the military action would be taken by NATO as a whole. And if one country in NATO takes military action, it is changing the legal obligation of other members if that country is then attacked. And so I think we have to keep in mind this distinction between sending weapons, sending support, and actually doing something that involves a military action.
I don't want to dominate this, exchange, but I guess what I'm trying to say that if a Ukrainian pilots go to Poland and fly back these planes, right? Like how is that a military action and how is that?
Because it's over NATO airspace. It is happening over NATO.
But they're already flying the Stingers and whatever over NATO airspace and then getting the listen. I mean, I'm no military expert. I don't want to argue over this, but I'm just saying that since the pattern that we had seen, that things that seemed impossible 3 days ago become possible, later on. So I'm like, maybe you'll be right. Maybe not, NATO will do nothing else, and millions of Ukrainians are going to be bombed in their cities. Maybe, or maybe they will do something, along those lines of one-on-one assistance that hasn't been done yet. I just don't know.
Okay, thanks to both of you for the comments there. I want to maybe bring Brian back into the discussion here, and Oxana as well. Oxana, you mentioned earlier about and we've talked a number of times about it. It appears that Putin's original goal here was to get to Kyiv, capture the city, and as you said, Oxana, decapitate the government. How important has Zelensky become to the resistance at this point in time? Zelensky has stated that there are people trying to assassinate him. And yet we've been talking as well here, both of you have made the points here that just the level of resistance in civil society is so dramatic at this point, and so much more dramatic than Russia thought, certainly than Russia thought it would be, but maybe even than Ukrainians thought it themselves. Is Zelensky now, if Zelensky was to be removed from the equation at this point in time, how much of a blow would that be to Ukrainian resistance to Russia, or do you think, at this point, that's sort of immaterial? There will be someone who will, as Tim said, there are always people. There will be someone who will emerge as a central person. Maybe it'll be someone based in Lviv, farther from the fighting at that point in time. Or is Zelensky really sort of key to this effort? He certainly has played a large role on the international stage, from a kind of, in terms of going back to what we were talking about before with sort of hybrid warfare and information war, which I'll come back to in the next question a little bit more on. But, he certainly, some of the line that he made about not needing a ride and needing ammunition, that has resonated absolutely globally. He has become a bit of a figure. So I'm interested in sort of Zelensky's role, the crucialness of Zelensky going forward. Brian, maybe first, and Oksana, if you want to jump in on that as well.
I think the role the person he became in this crisis is extraordinary. It is absolutely not a myth that an enormous number of Ukrainians who did not vote for him, who did not like his presidential style, perhaps didn't even take him seriously, just feel he underwent a transformation. He found himself in this crisis. I can personally speak to a very large number of Ukrainians I know who believe that they find it extraordinary that he is playing this role, and that as I said, he seems to have found himself. He seems to really have become a different leader in this situation. I think a very important role he's playing is in the extraordinary delicacy of negotiations. Russia's negotiating position is vicious. Includes all of the ideological madness that Putin built into his initial justification for this war, and yet Zelensky has been going at negotiations in good faith with his team, who also seem to have, I think, sort of undergone what I think a lot of people would think of as this sort of a maturation under this fire. And I think that people trust him, that he's not rushing into concessions, but that he is thinking about the future of Ukraine. Most of all, I'd worry what would happen to that negotiations process, which may be the only way we get a humanitarian corridor to Mariupol to Severodonetsk, where I have relatives currently under horrific siege. just a small personal detail of the three apartments in that very small Russian-speaking classic Donbass city between my wife, myself, and her parents, livable condition, and they're currently hoping to be able to stay in the third one of our apartments between our two families. But we don't know if that will be possible. That gives a sense just for the level of construction. So, you know, the negotiations process is where I feel Ukrainians have, in many places, but particularly there, put an extraordinary trust in Zelensky, and losing him right now, I'm not sure that process could go forward. I think Ukrainians are giving him the benefit of the doubt. I think we in the West need to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's going through this torturous process of understanding how this war could potentially, theoretically, stop. His representative, public representative, Mr. Arestovich, has been saying recently, we see slight ideological slipping on the side of the Russian delegation. They're starting to stop using some of their incredibly loaded words. You know, he's, I think, trying to give the Ukrainian people a little bit of optimism that Russia might be beginning to recognize how in many ways their military operation was a bloody fiasco, and maybe opening a crack of a door to a negotiated settlement Ukraine could live with. And that's where personally I would be most afraid to lose President Zelensky, because I'm not sure who else Ukrainians right now believe has the right combination in his mind of defending Ukraine's honor. I just don't know how else to put it, and its people and their lives. Yeah, that I think I might be there.
Thank you very much, Brian. Oksana, did you want to say anything?
Yes, I'll make 2 points on this. Like one, echoing Brian about, you know, Zelensky kind of incredible leadership, but really nobody expected, right? Before the war started, I mean, from, you know, some of my colleagues, they were saying, oh, not only, you know, Ukraine is in this predicament, you also have a clown for a president, right? Like how much worse can that be, right? And of course, you know, also in the polls before the war, I think there were, you know, most people did not believe, you know, like the question was asked, do you believe Zelensky to lead the country in the war effort? Like it did not have majority support. And if you look at the polls now, and if you came over the last week, his support is now to 91%. Like this is just completely unprecedented, right? So I think the fact that he's leading the way he's leading certainly, you know, motivates and inspires Ukrainians. But I would make a second point that I think even if somehow Zelensky was removed, right, killed, I mean, that would really be the only way to remove him, right? I don't think that would end the resistance. And this is another thing that Putin underestimates about Ukraine, the grassroots and the strength of civil society. He dismisses it all, you know, be it pro-democracy mobilization or anything else. In his speech that he gave, you know, that pre-invasion speech, he said how, like with the Maidan, right, when Ukrainians came to protest in 2014, you know, US government was paying $10 million, I think, for like organizers of this, right, and spending $1 million a day, like. So he does not believe in people power, right? Like that's, he dismisses it. It's something he fears, I think, ultimately. But in Ukraine, I mean, do you think these people who are organized to deliver, you know, food to besieged residents, right? Like who are setting up, you know, the media organizations, like every aspect, like Zelensky is not directing it in some sort of centralized way, right? So there is this, you know, massive kind of grassroots mobilization. So of course it would be terrible, I think, if he, you know, if the government was decapitated, but I don't think that would be the end of the resistance if that were to happen, exactly because of this kind of, it's sort of, the two feed into each other, right? I think, you know, the government gets, you know, inspired and sort of keeps going because they see that the society is behind the effort, right? And the society also gets, you know, inspired from the leadership that they're getting. So both things work together here, I would say.
Thanks, Oksana, and thanks, Brian, for that. Just to alert the panelists, what I'm going to try to do is save the last 10 minutes to ask you to give you each about a couple of minutes to address the question of the title of this panel, which is like, what next? So after the discussion we've had here, you know, what I'm going to ask you that as your sort of closing remarks for what do you think is next for Ukraine in terms of both short term and more medium term. But before we get to that, Tim, I want to build on a question from Jim. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Dingeman, who is asking about like logistics questions being raised in the press around problems with the Russian army. And I was hoping, Tim, you could maybe speak to, I know we don't have I know you're not a military expert, but to speak a little bit towards corruption around procurements in Russia and what that may say about the state of the military. That, on the one hand, there's a story that Putin has spent the last 8 years building up, or the last 10 years, 15 years, really rebuilding Russia's military force. It's had training in Syria and in Grozny, and this is a honed military machine. On the other hand, we see this convoy that seemingly seems to not be going anywhere, or at least going much, much slower than it would have been expected, and some truly bizarre imagery that we're getting of military vehicles three to a side and being stuck and not being able to get anywhere. Can you maybe put that in the larger sort of context of the political economy of Russia in what others have called the sort of kleptocratic economy? And do you think that these are related? This is one of the explanations that we hear floating around. You see quite a bit of this on Twitter, that that maintenance hasn't been done on trucks correctly, that these are easy places where you can siphon off money. So I would just be interested in a couple words on that.
Great. So in my view, Putin, like a lot of autocrats, has to balance these two competing threats of a coup by his inner circle and mass mobilization to overthrow the government, in the same way that Democratic politicians fear being thrown out in a free and fair election. And the problem for Putin, right, is that satisfying the masses and your inner circle are often at odds with each other, and corruption is the perfect example of that, where Putin allows the inner circle to benefit from corruption, in all spheres of the Russian economy, but he can't let that corruption be so great that the economy completely tanks, right? So he has to balance this, balance these two forces. Corruption tends to be pervasive in areas of the economy that are most opaque. In most countries, that's the case. And the military is often a very opaque sector of society, so it becomes no surprise to anyone that there's a lot of corruption. Whether or not how that's impacting the Russian military effort is really difficult for me to judge. I think other problems are probably much more likely culprits for the slow advance. One is, this isn't the kind of war that the Russian military was designed to fight. They were thinking of tank battles within Europe rather than, being an occupying force in a country with a hostile population. Morale is not great for lots of reasons, in part because there's not really a convincing narrative for the Russian soldiers and conscripts to be, risking their lives. That said, Russia is a professional military. It's large. It's very, very capable. But morale is clearly on the side of the Ukrainians here. So I think, I can't really speak to whether or not, corruption is the reason for the slow advances. But I do think, as part of the broader problem facing Russia, this is, very important. This is a, very important consideration.
Thanks, Tim. I'd like to now use, as I said a moment ago, the last 10 minutes to ask each of our panelists to offer questions on what's next. There are a lot of questions coming in the Q&A around possible off-ramps. Right? One person mentioned, what if Ukraine, agreed not to join NATO for 25 years? Is that a possible off-ramp? I think we'll go in the opposite order that we went at the beginning. So Kim, if you can kick us off, and we have about 10 minutes left. So if I can ask the panelists to keep, remarks to 2 to 3 minutes, that would be great.
Sure. Just one comment to add to what Tim said about the convoy. What we now know is that convoy wasn't actually a convoy. It was individual smaller convoys that accidentally ended up getting joined because of those maintenance problems. So I guess on my final comments, what I want to say is that all the evidence that we have is Putin is indeed rational. What we see is that he is changing his tactics on the ground as the situation has changed. And the Russian military seems to be getting much more effective in the last couple of days than it was a couple of days prior to that. And what we know about rationality, as sort of a definition from social sciences, is that it's a combination of being goal-oriented, but of having excellent information. And Putin had poor information for whatever reason when he first launched the attack against Ukraine. But information about what happens if you get involved in a nuclear confrontation is not new. There's nothing that Putin needs to learn about that. The idea of mutual assured destruction was present in Soviet times and in Cold War times. I think it's well known that probably the situations on cyber questions are also in assured of mutual assured destruction between the United States and Russia if a line gets crossed. And so when we're thinking about what's next, I don't think that Putin is likely to want to escalate into NATO territory. And let me just close by saying I have great sympathy for Oxana and for the Ukrainian people. I know how incredibly frustrating it must be to see NATO's power sitting there right on your borders and not be able to utilize it. But it would not serve anybody's interests if the war were to expand beyond Ukraine's borders. That wouldn't help Ukraine, and it would harm a lot of people who are NATO citizens. And so it's truly a tragedy. And what I'm just trying to have done in my presentation is to explain why what's happening is what's happening, and not to say that it's a good outcome, because at this point there are no good outcomes.
Thank you, Kim. Tim?
Sure, I'll focus my remarks on some factors to think about going forward about Russian domestic politics. And remember, we are in very early days here, and we know that in any conflict, battle plans quickly get readjusted, and there are many surprises. And just as no military plan survives first contact with the enemy, no efforts at political spin also survive their first contact with reality. So I think it's very important what happens on the ground in Ukraine. If this appears to be a real quagmire for the Russian military, it's difficult it will be much more difficult for Putin to govern, because the dual pressures of keeping the elite satisfied and keeping the public off the streets, I think, will increase. Another thing to think about is for how long can Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine continue to hold order? I mean, given the incredible degree of unity among the Ukrainian populace that will resist in forms of violence and nonviolence, how willing will Russian troops on the ground be willing to instill order? Similarly, at home, if there are more mobilizations and more protests, how willing will security services within Russia continue to be to conduct this crackdown? We've seen little evidence that they have any scruples of not cracking down yet, but over time, I think that is something to watch. Another issue is just given the economic shock that the Russian economy is facing, is just how governable the country will be. For 20 years, Putin's main calling card has been that he brought stability to Russia after a very turbulent 1990s. And as that has been thrown out the window with this invasion, and just the basic ability to govern Russia and to keep daily life going, I think is really going to be far more challenging than President Putin has realized. So just the sheer challenge of keeping the trains running, I think, in Russia is going to be something that will have much greater political consequences. And if we begin to see opposition, it could be just from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Oksana?
Thank you. I second basically everything that Tim said. I would say there are some things that we can be relatively certain about at this point, and some things that are somewhat more uncertain. And I think the two certain things is what Putin's goals are. I don't think he will settle for anything less. than decapitation of Ukrainian government and destruction of Ukrainian state. And I think we also can be pretty certain that Ukraine will not capitulate and will continue to resist. And I would leave you to imagine the cost of that in the country of this size, in the population of this size, right? And as Kim said, with no additional support for NATO, most likely, right? Now, the uncertain parts, I think exactly what Tim was saying. We don't know how it's going to play out in Russia, what sort of domestic instability it might produce among the elites, among the public, how the Russian military would react. I mean, we already saw, the conscripts in particular, right? Some of them surrender, there is low morale. And like if they are, basically asked to continue leveling city after city and destroying the civilian life, right? Like, is that really guaranteed to happen? And the third, I think, also moving piece, right, the ability of the Ukrainian army to continue resisting, right? So I think some level of resistance, insurgency, civilian will certainly continue. But of course, the more the Ukrainian army can hold these advances, right, the more effectively they can defend cities, especially the capital city, right? Sort of these are the three, the way I see it, kind of the two most stable pieces and the three more moving pieces going forward.
Thanks, Oxana. Brian?
Yeah, I'd say very briefly, a few things I think about what comes next. Let me touch on a very optimistic scenario of what comes next, and I agree with Oxana that it's a little difficult to see the path to it right now. But that is if there is a negotiated settlement that Ukraine can live with, that leaves as much as possible of Ukraine under Ukrainian control by a Ukrainian state, then I think we in the West need to be thinking very seriously about what the massive support for reconstruction recovery will look like. And I think we need to try to focus it on stimulating Ukraine's own energy and industrial potential. There has been a certain tendency in the assistance of late from the West to move to some models like cheap credit to buy our stuff. That's not what Ukraine's going to need after a war of this ungodly destruction. It's going to need support to activate its own economic potential. Ukraine doesn't want dependence on anyone. Ukrainians don't want dependence on anyone, including their friends. And we just need to be thinking very, very hard about what that will look like in a way that maximally it releases Ukraine's own potential and isn't sort of an airdrop assistance into a devastated economy. And in a less optimistic scenario that I think we need to be mentally prepared for, how can we support Ukrainian civil society and even business, but in particular culturally, civil society, if some part of it or all of it is living in exile? Some part of it, for instance, might be Eastern Ukrainian civil society. If that part of the country cannot be kept under government control, but we really don't know how far Putin's murderous ambitions will take him. How do we support, in some amount of displacement and exile, this extraordinary multicultural and pluralistic society? How do we help maintain the best that we have seen? How do we help support Ukrainians to maintain the best that we've seen in the unbelievable effort that their country is making right now? How do we make sure that all of the voices of Ukraine, including so many Eastern Ukrainians right now, just as I saw when I first arrived in Ukraine in 2015, passionately, sincerely expressing their love for country and devotion to it in Russian as well as Ukrainian. How do we help this, again, plural, multicultural, extraordinary, real Ukraine maintain its identity when it may on some level have to be disconnected from some of the places that it's organic to? That's a heartbreaking question, but we may have to address it. And I think that's one of the things that we may be looking at what's next, either, again, for some part of the country or for a greater part of it.
Thank you, Brian. Please join. I hope everyone in the audience can join with me in thanking our panelists for taking the time at what is a very difficult time on multiple levels to spend some time with all of us here today for what was a very, very illuminating conversation. I want to thank all of them once again. I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for providing funding. I want to thank the Harriman Institute at Columbia for hosting the event as well, and our co-sponsors, the other co-sponsors of the event.